The story follows Keanu Reeves, who unexpectedly becomes a hero during a hijacking on a flight. Despite his calm demeanor and decisive actions that save the passengers, the narrative highlights disturbing elements that underscore deep racial biases. The hijacker, portrayed as a desperate and erratic figure, is implicitly marked by his race, while other characters in the cabin react with fear and prejudice. As the story unfolds, questions of heroism are intertwined with societal discomfort, emphasizing how race influences both the perception of danger and the actions deemed heroic. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the international flight, his calm yet magnetic presence drawing subtle attention. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that embraced his tall, lean frame, his simple white shirt, sans tie, spoke of effortless sophistication. He didn't seek attention, nor did he try to disappear. Though he blended in with the crowd, his composed air and intense gaze inevitably caught the eyes of those around him. "Isn't that Keanu Reeves?" a young man whispered to his companion, his eyes wide with excitement. "Don't bother him," the friend muttered, gently pulling him back. Keanu took little notice. He had grown accustomed to such curious glances, but today he wasn't a famous actor. He was just another passenger, on his way to somewhere, quietly existing in a space he had come to know well. With steady steps, he ascended the boarding stairs. Each movement was measured, unhurried, as if the airplane was an old friend, welcoming him back. Inside the plane, the soft, warm glow of ambient lighting set a serene tone, while cool air from the vents brushed against the passengers, soothing their tired bodies after a long wait. Keanu entered, scanning the cabin slowly. He wasn't in a hurry. His gaze moved over the passengers, quietly taking in the small stories unfolding around him. In the front row, a little girl of about 8 clutched a pink teddy bear to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the window. She was speaking animatedly to her mother. "Mom, does the plane fly as fast as Superman?" she asked with a bright smile. Her mother, smiling softly, pulled her closer and whispered, "Even faster, sweetheart. We'll fly above the clouds." Not far off, a middle-aged businessman sat, his tired face marked by dark circles. He wore a wrinkled suit, his attention consumed by the laptop in front of him. His fingers tapped away rhythmically, the noise mirroring the strain of his long hours. He occasionally sighed, sipping coffee from a plastic cup, trying to maintain focus. At the back of the cabin, a group of young adults chatted and laughed, crowded together as they shared a phone, watching short videos. Their bursts of laughter were unrestrained, oblivious to the annoyed looks of others nearby. A young flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle. Her hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her smile exuded both warmth and professionalism. As she passed an elderly passenger, she leaned down, her voice gentle, asking, "Would you like some more water, sir?" Keanu's lips curled into a faint smile. Each person around him was caught in their own world, their individual stories unfolding in this shared space. He continued walking to a seat near the emergency exit, a spot he had come to favor over the years. It was neither too close to the crowd nor too distant, and he could see everything. He placed his carry-on bag in the overhead bin with careful, deliberate movements, as though he had all the time in the world. Once seated, Keanu leaned back, letting out a long, slow breath, loosening the collar of his shirt. His gaze swept across the cabin one final time before he allowed his eyes to drift closed. The hum of the plane's engines grew louder, a steady, calming rhythm that felt like the pulse of the entire flight. The cool air brushed against him, easing the tension in his mind. He couldn't remember the last time he had experienced such quiet, unhurried moments. A few hours of peace, he thought to himself, savoring the rare gift, but peace, he knew, was fragile. It was a thin veil, a momentary calm before life's unpredictable shifts. Outside, the sky stretched into a vast, endless expanse, clouds drifting like soft wisps. Inside the cabin, the passengers remained unaware of the unknowns ahead, lost in their own thoughts. Keanu, for a moment, allowed himself to relax in the tranquil atmosphere. However, a subtle tension began to build in his chest, an intangible sense of something stirring in the air. It was a feeling, a premonition, that something was about to change. 2 hours passed since takeoff. The soft lighting continued to bathe the cabin in a serene ambiance. Keanu, half asleep in his seat, appeared content, like someone holding on to a fleeting moment of peace amidst the chaos of life. Then, a faint sound, something small enough to be ignored by most, but sharp enough to disrupt the stillness, broke the calm. Keanu's eyes snapped open, his brow furrowing slightly, the disturbance sending a ripple through the tranquility of the moment. Keanu remained still, his gaze fixed on the unfolding chaos, his every sense heightened by the growing tension. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, a subtle shift that made the hairs on his neck prickle. In the aisle, a middle-aged man rose abruptly, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He wore an old, oversized black coat, as if trying to conceal his frail, hunched frame. His steps were quick and uneven, burdened by some invisible weight. A few heads turned, curiosity flickering in the eyes of nearby passengers, while a flight attendant further down the aisle raised an eyebrow but maintained her practiced smile. The man stopped abruptly in the middle of the cabin, blocking the aisle. He yanked a backpack from his shoulder and dropped it to the floor with a loud thud. The sudden motion startled a few passengers, and a ripple of unease spread through the cabin. The man crouched down and began rummaging through the bag with trembling hands, his breath ragged and uneven. Then, in a flash, he stood up, clutching a makeshift device in his hands. It was a small metal box, its red lights blinking erratically, with a tangled mess of wires protruding from it. He held it up, his bloodshot eyes scanning the cabin. His voice, rough and frantic, shattered the silence. "Shut up! Don't move!" he roared. "This plane belongs to me now!" His words hit like an explosion, sending shockwaves through the passengers. The fragile calm that had enveloped the cabin evaporated in an instant. Screams erupted as children wailed in terror. A woman in the front row clutched her young daughter, pressing the girl's face against her chest as she whispered, trying to comfort her in a shaky voice. "Don't be scared, sweetheart. Don't be scared." A man tried to stand, but when his eyes caught the gleam of a knife in the hijacker's hand, his face drained of color, and he collapsed back into his seat. The air felt thick, suffocating, as all eyes locked onto the man in the aisle. No one dared move. The hijacker's gaze swept over the cabin, searching for defiance. His breathing was rapid and uneven as he gripped the knife. He stumbled forward, grabbing the wrist of a young flight attendant nearby. She gasped and shrieked, unable to react before he yanked her toward him, pressing the sharp blade against her neck. "Open the cockpit door. Now you've got 3 minutes or she dies," he snarled, his voice quivering with fear and rage. The tension in the cabin was palpable, suffocating. A few passengers bowed their heads, silently sobbing, while the cries of frightened children pierced through the chaos. Keanu remained seated, his eyes wide open and fixed on the man causing the havoc. His gaze was sharp, calm, and unsettlingly focused. There was no panic, no sign of fear. Keanu observed everything: the hijacker's unsteady grip on the knife, the crude, blinking device in his hands, the passengers around him trembling, heads bowed in fear, their eyes avoiding his. For a moment, his eyes briefly landed on a little girl clutching a stuffed bear in the row ahead. Her tear-filled eyes met his, silently pleading for something, anything. Keanu's heart tightened. For a brief moment, he took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the armrest. His broad shoulders remained still, unyielding, like a fortress amidst the storm. The hijacker shouted again, pressing the blade harder against the flight attendant's throat. She sobbed uncontrollably, her body trembling in his grasp. Keanu stayed still, but inside, every instinct was firing. His mind raced, forming a plan, a way to act. The air in the cabin was thick with fear, the sounds of laughter, conversation, and even the rhythmic clicking of keyboards gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Only the muffled cries of children and the labored breaths of terrified passengers filled the space. The dim yellow lights reflected off their tense faces, beads of sweat dripping down their foreheads. The hijacker stood in the aisle, his grip tightening on the flight attendant's wrist. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and filled with a mixture of desperation and fear. His body was taut, trembling. His voice shook as he yelled at the passengers, trying to maintain control of the situation. A middle-aged man sitting near the aisle, a man in his 50s, gathered his courage and spoke up, his voice wavering but sincere. "Please, calm down, we can talk. You don't have to do this." The hijacker turned sharply, his hollow eyes locking onto the older man. Without warning, he lunged at him, shoving him violently back into his seat. The man's shoulder collided with the hard edge of the seat with a sickening thud, and he groaned in pain. The sharp sound echoed through the silent cabin, like an alarm bell ringing in everyone's ears. "Shut up, I don't need your advice. Sit down," the hijacker roared, his voice cracking, his desperation evident. The cabin fell even quieter, the fear palpable. A few passengers turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight. A young woman nearby covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. An elderly man clutched the crucifix around his neck, praying silently. Up front, the little girl with the stuffed bear huddled in her mother's arms, her face pale with fear. Her wide eyes darted around the cabin, locking onto Keanu's. She tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, whispering softly, "Mom, what is that man going to do?" The mother forced a trembling smile, her hands shaking as she pulled her daughter closer, as if trying to shield her from the invisible terror surrounding them. Keanu remained seated, his eyes never leaving the hijacker. He observed everything, slowly, deliberately. The hijacker's movements were growing more erratic. The knife wavered in his hand. The blinking device in his grasp continued its countdown. The passengers around him were paralyzed, frozen in terror. No one dared move. A sudden clarity struck Keanu like a jolt of electricity. This man wasn't a professional. He had no plan. He was scared, and his fear made him unpredictable, a ticking time bomb. His heartbeat quickened, but his mind remained calm. He inhaled deeply, steadying his breath. A man in the back corner discreetly held up a phone, recording the scene. Another passenger sat hunched, trembling, while others clasped each other's hands tightly, trying to find some sense of safety in their shared fear. Keanu's hand tightened on the armrest. A single question echoed in his mind, louder than the chaos surrounding him. If I don't do something, who will? A quiet anger began to stir within him, not reckless, but focused, a force waiting to be unleashed. Keanu slowly rose from his seat. His broad shoulders cast a shadow over the narrow aisle. The The sound of his seatbelt unbuckling made a few passengers flinch, their eyes wide with fear. A young woman gasped urgently, "What? What are you doing? Don't do this!" Keanu didn't answer. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no hesitation. Each movement was calculated, purposeful, as if the very air around him cleared to make way for him. The hijacker's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing in suspicion and fury as he saw Keanu approaching. He yanked the flight attendant closer, his eyes wild, his grip on the knife tightening. But Keanu, with an unwavering gaze, continued his steady march toward the man, ready for what was coming next. The terrorist's grip tightened around the flight attendant, the cold blade pressing deeper against her neck. His breath was ragged, his voice trembling with fear as he screamed. "What are you doing? Stop, I said. Sit down." Keanu paused a few steps away, his eyes locked on the hijackers, steady and unyielding. His voice, low and calm, cut through the tension like a blade. "Let her go. You don't want to do this." Keanu's words weren't loud or aggressive, but they carried a quiet power that filled the space. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. No one moved. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. The only sound was the blinking red light on the makeshift device, and the steady gaze Keanu held on the hijacker. It was as though an invisible battle unfolded before them. One man spiraling into madness, the other standing firm, unmoving like a mountain in the face of a storm. The hijacker swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the flight attendant. Conflict flickered in his eyes, desperation and confusion warring inside him. Keanu didn't look away. He closed the distance by another inch. "Stop this before it's too late," he said. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, all eyes on Keanu, who stood unshaken at the epicenter of the storm. The quiet hum of the airplane outside the windows was now a distant sound, replaced by the pounding heartbeat of every passenger. They all watched Keanu with a mix of fear, astonishment, and a growing thread of hope. Keanu was no longer just a passenger. He was the center of this storm, and everyone knew it. With each step Keanu took, the weight of the tension in the air grew heavier. The terrorist's grip tightened further on the flight attendant, pressing the blade deeper into her neck. She whimpered, tears streaming down her face, silently pleading for help. Keanu stopped, casting a long shadow across the floor. He didn't speak immediately, but his gaze pinned the hijacker in place. It wasn't anger or fear in his eyes. It was clarity, a piercing focus that seemed to cut through the hijacker's madness, exposing the fragile, desperate person inside. Keanu's voice rumbled through the air again, low, steady, final. "You need to stop. Don't let this go any further." The hijacker froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed the calm authority in Keanu's words. He was confused, furious, and more than a little unsettled by the unshakable presence standing before him. He roared, desperate and wild. "Who do you think you are? I said sit down. You want to die." Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Instead, he took another deliberate step forward. That was it. The hijacker snapped completely. With a furious scream, he released the flight attendant and lunged at Keanu, the knife flashing in his hand. His movement was feral, an animalistic, desperate attack, as though he was going for the kill. Passengers screamed in terror. A woman covered her mouth in shock, her face pale with fear. A little girl clutched her teddy bear, tears in her eyes, hiding in her mother's lap. But Keanu was different to him. Everything seemed to slow down. The terrorist charged, knife raised, but Keanu's movements were precise and fluid. In a blink, He dodged the attack by mere inches. Keanu's hand shot out, fast and firm, grabbing the terrorist's wrist. A sickening crack echoed through the cabin as Keanu wrenched the man's wrist back, forcing the knife to drop with a sharp clang. The terrorist howled in pain, his face contorted, sweat pouring from his forehead. But Keanu wasn't done. With one swift motion, Keanu used the hijacker's momentum against him, slamming him to the floor with enough force that the entire plane seemed to tremble. The passengers flinched at the sound of impact. The terrorist lay sprawled on the floor, his wrist pinned, both arms held tight in Keanu's unyielding grip. He thrashed weakly, shouting in desperation, "Let me go! You don't know who I am! Let me go!" Keanu leaned down, his face mere inches from the terrorist's. His voice was icy, sharp, and unwavering. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The cabin fell into a dead silence, every pair of eyes fixed on the scene before them. The flight attendants, stunned into stillness, watched in disbelief. Keanu's gaze remained steady, unwavering, as he held the hijacker in place, a silent force that commanded the room. A flight attendant, her hands still trembling from the ordeal, rushed forward to retrieve the knife and the makeshift device that had fallen to the floor. The timer on the device was still ticking, its numbers counting down toward 0. Keanu glanced at it, his expression darkening. The terrorist still had one final card to play, but no one could be certain just how dangerous it was. The young flight attendant, still shaken by the terror she'd just endured, stood nearby. Her cheeks were wet with tears, but she managed to whisper to Keanu, her voice trembling, You saved me, thank you." Keanu looked at her, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentler now. She nodded, her legs shaky as she took a few hesitant steps back. The hijacker lay on the floor, panting heavily, his body defeated, but his furious, desperate glare remained locked on Keanu. The cabin had fallen into an odd stillness, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Keanu slowly straightened, his eyes sweeping over the passengers. A strange reverence had settled over them. Some were crying, others had their hands over their mouths, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Keanu's voice rang out, steady and strong, filling the cabin with a quiet authority. "Everyone stay calm. Everything is under control." His words were like a breath of fresh air, sweeping away the suffocating shadow of fear that had gripped the cabin. For the first time, a glimmer of hope shone through. Keanu had done more than just save the flight attendant. He had pulled everyone back from the edge of a nightmare. But he knew this wasn't over yet. The timer on the device was still ticking, and he needed to ensure the threat was fully neutralized. As if on cue, the beeping of the device began again, sharp and jarring. The countdown resumed, the numbers relentlessly dropping. 35, 34, 33. The cabin erupted into chaos once again. Gasps, sobs, frantic murmurs filled the air. An elderly man gripped his seat with trembling hands, his whispers barely audible as he muttered prayers. A young woman broke into uncontrollable tears, burying her face into the shoulder of the person beside her. A little girl, still clutching her teddy bear, asked her mother softly, "Mommy, is it going to explode?" The mother, pale as a sheet, could barely manage a breath. "No, sweetheart. Someone will help us." Every eye in the cabin turned to Keanu, the man who had become their anchor in the storm. His posture remained calm, unwavering, even as the seconds on the countdown continued to slip away. A male flight attendant, pale and fearful, stammered, You can't touch it. It could go off at any second." Keanu turned his head, his gaze steady and commanding. His voice was firm, like an order that allowed no room for protest. "If I don't touch it, we won't have any time left. Trust me." Fearful, but desperate for hope, no one dared argue. They stepped back, giving him the space he needed. Keanu knelt beside the device, his hands steady as he reached for it. The cold metal casing sent a sharp chill through his palms. The red light blinked rapidly, mocking everyone's desperate hope. 28, 27, 26. Keanu's eyes scanned the device, every nerve in his body stretched taut. Memories surged through him. Training, survival, countless brushes with death. He focused intently on the wires, scrutinizing every detail. One red wire connected to the main circuit board. One blue wire linked to a backup power source. Any wire could be a trap. 20, 19, 18. If he cut the wrong wire, everything would end. He couldn't afford to think about that. His heart raced, but his mind remained sharp and clear. He drew a deep breath, focused. 10, 9, 8. With a swift, decisive motion, Keanu sliced through the red wire with a small key he'd pulled from his pocket. A faint click echoed through the cabin, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. The red light on the device flickered and went dark. The beeping stopped. The countdown ceased. For a single breath, everyone froze. The cabin erupted into a wave of relief. Cries, gasps, and sobs of gratitude filled the air, flowing through the cabin like a cleansing tide. A woman broke down, clinging to the person beside her. "We're alive. We're really alive," she sobbed. The young mother held her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. The little girl looked up at Keanu, her eyes wide and full of gratitude. "He saved us, Mommy." Keanu relaxed his grip on the device, gently setting it on the floor. The storm had passed. For now, at least. Keanu Reeves sank back into his seat, his breath steadying after the storm of chaos. In that moment, he was no longer the public figure the world knew, no longer the famous actor. He was just a man who had done what was necessary when faced with a crisis. The weight of the moment slowly began to lift. A flight attendant approached him, her face still streaked with tears. "Thank you. Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "If it weren't for you..." Keanu offered her a subtle nod, his expression softening. He gave her a faint smile, the kind that reassured without words. "It's over now," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Everything's going to be okay." The cabin lights began to brighten, the soft hum of the airplane filling the space. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, still full of emotion. "We've overcome the emergency. Please remain calm. We will land safely as soon as possible." Applause broke out, mingled with cries of joy and overwhelming relief. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath as his shoulders slumped, as though he had finally set down an enormous burden. A warmth spread through his chest as the cabin came alive again, passengers chatting, laughing, the sense of life returning to normal. But deep inside, Keanu knew this wasn't truly over. The journey was nearing its end, but a new kind of challenge still lay ahead. The plane began its descent, the low hum of the engines vibrating rhythmically beneath their feet. Outside the window, runway lights appeared like distant lighthouses, guiding the plane safely through the night. The danger had passed, but the feeling of relief hadn't fully set in for everyone. Hundreds of hearts still raced in their chests, as if they couldn't quite believe they had made it through. Keanu sat silently, his gaze fixed on the darkened sky outside. Strands of black hair fell loosely across his forehead, his face a study in calm, as though what had just occurred was just another moment in a long line of inevitable events. He loosened his collar, his posture relaxing, yet something still lingered in his eyes, an unspoken weariness, a reflection of the weight of everything that had happened. A voice broke the silence, warm but laced with emotion. It was the captain again. "Ladies and gentlemen, our flight has landed safely. We extend our heartfelt thanks to you all for your composure and cooperation. We wish you a peaceful new day." A ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, but soon swelling into a wave of gratitude. The clapping rang out like a chorus of second chances, a celebration of life in the wake of a near tragedy. Keanu remained seated, his expression unchanged. His job had been done, and now he let the sounds of relief wash over him. But as the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, he knew that for them, the real journey had only just begun. The door opened, and light from security vehicles outside flooded the cabin. Officers, rescue teams, and journalists had already gathered, ready to handle the aftermath. 2 officers boarded the plane, heading straight for the hijacker. He was dragged to his feet, his hands bound behind his back, his once defiant face now pale and broken. The manic energy he had carried moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind a crumpled figure, consumed by despair and humiliation. As he was led off the plane, the passengers nearest the aisle watched, some still struggling to process the chaos they had just survived. The flight attendant who had been held hostage slowly walked toward Keanu, her face still streaked with tears, but now bearing a small, relieved smile. She stood in front of him, her voice shaking as she tried to steady herself. You saved us all. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched at the hem of her uniform. "Thank you. Truly. Thank you." Keanu nodded gently, offering her a small, warm smile. "No need to thank me," he said softly. "I just did what needed to be done." From behind, the soft sound of hurried footsteps approached a little girl, clutching her teddy bear, ran toward him, her braided hair bouncing with each step. She stopped in front of him, her wide eyes filled with admiration. "Mister," she said excitedly, "you're a superhero, aren't you? You beat the bad guy and saved everyone." Keanu looked down at her, his gaze softening. He crouched to her level, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm no superhero," he said with a warm smile. "I'm just an ordinary person. Anyone can do what I did, as long as they're willing to stand up when it matters." The little girl tilted her head, clearly pondering his words. Then, with a bright smile, she hugged her teddy bear tightly to her chest, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "But to me, you're a superhero." Keanu chuckled softly, ruffling her hair affectionately before standing up. He walked toward the overhead compartment, retrieving his small carry-on bag. Outside, the flashing lights of cameras and reporters' questions flared in a relentless storm of attention. A crowd had gathered, eager to capture the moment and uncover the identity of the hero who had saved the flight. But Keanu had no interest in the spotlight. With his bag in hand, he walked down the plane's stairs. The reporters shouted questions, their voices rising in a clamor. "Who saved the flight? Can you tell us what happened? Are you the hero everyone's talking about?" Keanu didn't respond. His head bowed slightly, his hair falling to obscure part of his face. He moved through the crowd, his steps slow but steady, unbothered by the chaos around him. No one stopped him. No one had another word to say. Within moments, he had disappeared into the flow of passengers in the airport, blending seamlessly into the crowd as unremarkable as a shadow. The sky outside had begun to pale, soft blue light chasing away the remnants of the night. Keanu paused for a moment, glancing up at the heavens, his mind clear. He wasn't a hero. He had simply done what needed to be done, what anyone could do if they had enough courage. Perhaps that was enough. Behind him, passengers embraced, crying tears of joy and relief, but Keanu kept walking. For him, this was all that was needed, the quiet satisfaction of having made the right choice. The world would soon hear the story of what happened on the flight, but the real impact had already begun. Keanu knew that. The next morning, videos of his actions spread like wildfire, dominating social media platforms and major news outlets. From TikTok to Facebook, the footage of Keanu standing calm amidst the chaos captured the attention of millions. Headlines read, "Keanu Reeves saves flight, hero in real life." The hashtags began to flood social media. Don't watch do. A simple message, but one that sparked a global movement. A reminder to stand up, to act when it matters. Keanu refused interviews. He turned down talk shows. His representative issued a brief statement that Keanu didn't want to be the center of attention. The world waited for him to say something, but he remained silent, content with his own sense of purpose. A few days later, a video appeared. Keanu, alone, sitting in a simple room. The setting was ordinary, the light soft and natural. He spoke directly into the camera, his voice steady and earnest. "I am not a hero," he began, pausing briefly to let the words sink in. "I just did what any of us should do when we see something wrong. Don't turn away, don't stand still. Take action. It doesn't have to be grand, it just has to matter." The video was short, just under 2 minutes, but in those 2 minutes, something changed. The hashtag "Don't Watch, Do" exploded, and soon stories flooded social media of people standing up to bullying, helping those in need, taking small actions that could change the world. Keanu's message had been heard, and the movement was alive. Schools showed the video, reminding students that courage didn't need to be grand. It was in the simple act of standing up. Keanu, as always, remained silent. He rejected the fame, the accolades, but deep down, he knew his actions had made a difference. One small act could indeed create a ripple that changed everything. A week later, as Keanu sat alone in a quiet cafe, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Attached was a hand-drawn picture of a little girl hugging a teddy bear with the words, "Thank you for saving us. You're a superhero in my heart." Keanu stared at the picture, a faint smile crossing his face. Sometimes that was all the recognition he needed. Sometimes one small act was enough to change the world. The evening light cast long shadows over the street as Keanu left the cafe. The sounds of the city filled the air as he blended seamlessly into the crowd, just another ordinary person. But within him, a quiet flame burned, small but steady. As night fell, the stars began to shimmer in the vast sky, reminding him that even the smallest actions could form something extraordinary, just as a single act of courage can light up the darkest corners of the world. Keanu knew that he was just one such person.